I'm Daniela Cambone with StansberryInvestor.com, and my guest today is the author of Bitcoin, The Future of Money, and his latest, which we'll be talking about, Daylight Robbery, How Tax Shaped Our Past and Will Change Our Future. Please welcome to the show, Dominic Frisby. Dominic, you are a blast from my past. I haven't seen you in probably 10 years, so welcome to Stansberry Investor.
Thanks very much, Daniela. I think the last time we met was at PDAC in maybe 2011 or 2012, sort
Wow.
of when mining stocks still went up.
When mining stocks still went up, and no one really cared about Bitcoin yet, right?
They didn't. And it had just been invented. And I think it's easy to say in retrospect, but imagine if everyone had rolled out of mining and into Bitcoin in 2011.
Can you imagine? I can't imagine. So I want to talk to you about that because we're going to talk about your new book, but your Bitcoin book you actually wrote in 2014, correct?
Well, it was published in 2014, but actually wrote it in 2013. Traditional publishing is so slow.
But it was actually the first book by a real publisher on Bitcoin. So you were really at the avant-garde of this cryptocurrency. So I want to ask you about the big news, Tesla buying a boatload of Bitcoin here. Will this create executive FOMO, fear of missing out, and will just create a tidal wave here?
Well, I think so. I mean, it was already pretty clear. It had been signposted for a while that Elon Musk liked Bitcoin. He put Bitcoin in his biography on Twitter, and he said that in January that Tesla was diversifying into gold and Bitcoin. By the way, Elon Musk is South African, and South Africans like gold. They have an understanding of gold. It really wouldn't surprise me if Tesla diversified some of its assets into gold as well, and that would give gold a much needed bit of impetus. But in any case, what it's done is Musk isn't the first. This chap, Michael Saylor, who was in charge of MicroStrategy, listed on the NASDAQ, and Jack Dorsey of Twitter, they were probably the first to start putting their corporate treasuries into Bitcoin. But Musk has legitimized it. And Musk has already, I worked out, he probably paid somewhere between 30 and 35,000 for his Bitcoins. It's already 47,000. He's already $500 million in profit on the trade. So but the more people, like Musk has legitimized it. But it's not just that he's legitimized investing in Bitcoin. Like everyone else will see how he's done, and CEOs are going to go, oh, we've got to do something with our cash. We're losing 10%, against asset price inflation every year. And they're going to come under incredible pressure from shareholders. They're all going to be on earnings calls, and their shareholders are going, why aren't you diversifying into Bitcoin? You're supposed to be the CEO. You're supposed to be the imaginative one, the leader. Why aren't you doing it? So Bitcoin has a habit of doing this. It creates FOMO, and it's already done it at the individual level, and next it's going to do it at the corporate level. So it's got to be a bullish sign.
Yeah, very interesting. And we've had Michael Saylor on multiple times on this show. And you're right. When he took that decision back in August, everyone thought he was crazy. But obviously it's worked out for MicroStrategy, and it looks like he did get to Elon Musk. So when you hear,
can I just say, Michael Saylor has shown incredible vision, and he's been like, this latest move in Bitcoin is almost single-handedly been down to Michael Saylor and the eloquence with which he's spoken about it, and the passion with which he's spoken about it, and the intellect with which he's spoken about it. And he's just, he's really driven this. Bitcoin keeps reinventing its narrative, and he's really driven this sort of corporate cash narrative. He's a real hero.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. So Dominic, I'm assuming you're obviously a big proponent of Bitcoin, but when you hear talk of 100,000 or Max Kaiser's 220,000 call for this year, do you see that happening?
I remember when Max was talking about Bitcoin going to $100, and I remember thinking, oh, Max, you're being ridiculous.
Wow.
The surprises with Bitcoin are always to the upside.
Let's talk about your new book now, Dominic, Daylight Robbery, How Tax Shaped Our Past and Will Change Our Future. Now, no one wants to talk about taxes, Dominic, because it's almost like if we talk about it, the tax man might hear us and keep raising taxes. We're not supposed to talk about taxes.
Well, yeah, we've got taxes. Tax is the boring domain of accountants. Who wants to talk about tax? But one of the reasons I was a gold bug, investing in mining stocks and investing in Bitcoin, is I was convinced that so many of the roots of our problems in the West lie in our flawed system of money. And if we're going to save the world, we need to get rid of fiat money, and whether it's go to a gold standard or a Bitcoin standard or a bit of both. And that was my view for many years. And I've evolved that now. And I'm now convinced that I've started to look at the world through the prism of taxation. And I've realized that tax is power. If a leader or a government or an emperor or a ruler, they lose control of their tax base, they lose control of their power. And this has been the case throughout history. Now, there has never been a civilization in all history that didn't have some kind of taxation. Tax wasn't always paid in cash. You often paid your taxes with your labor or with a share of your produce. But, you know, ever since ancient Mesopotamia, we've been paying taxes one way or the other. And in fact, this idea of a sense of duty to the greater collective probably existed in the hunter-gatherer societies that predated civilization. And I've started to look at the world through this prism of taxation, and I've realized that every single great event in history has some kind of tax story at its heart, without which the event would have unfolded in a way that was very different. Every war was paid for by some kind of taxes, either during or after the event. You tax and then you plunder. Every conquest was about taking control of the tax base, the land, the labor, the produce, the profits. Every revolution was a rising up against some kind of injustice perpetrated by the tax system. You know, no taxation without representation being the most famous example. Even things like Jesus Christ, the birth of Christ. The reason Mary and Joseph were in Bethlehem was to pay taxes. And the crime for which Christ was eventually prosecuted and crucified was forbidding to give tribute to Caesar. In other words, telling people not to pay their taxes. The first men on the moon, NASA, was a tax-funded operation. And even things like our surnames, the reason we have surnames was that leaders started using surnames in order to differentiate people for the purposes of collecting taxes. So you would either be named after some geographical feature, some prominent geographical feature where you lived. You might be called, Ford or Hill or something like that, or you'd be named after your line, Jackson. Or you'd be named after some
profession, whatever if someone was working
profession, Smith or Gardner or whatever it is, or even some defining physical characteristic. Kennedy means shaggy head. Cameron means crooked nose. And once you start, and you just realize everywhere you look, the buildings are built in the way they're built, often to comply with tax regulations and pay as little taxes as possible. And you just suddenly realize that just tax is everywhere. And even today, and this all throughout history, but even today, there is barely an activity that you can name that doesn't involve taxation of some kind. And immediately I say that, people start thinking of one activity, and the bed you do it on is taxed. Everything you do involves taxation. It's everywhere. And so I've attempted to describe history, describe the world in which we live, and describe, you determine a nation's destiny by the way you tax it. How prosperous its people will be, or how poor, how free they are, or how repressed. And you can, once you start to look at the world, you can just see exactly how things are going to go in the future. And inflation, by the way, is a form of taxation. Every gold and Bitcoin bug's biggest bugbear is inflation, taxation without legislation. It's just another form of taxation. Debt is a tax on the future. And just suddenly, all these things will start going off. And so that's what I've attempted to do in this book.
Yeah, well, I know offline we were saying it's an important read for Bitcoin and gold investors. Talk a little bit more why taxation is linked to Bitcoin and gold.
Well, the Bitcoin and gold investors are convinced that if we're going to save the world, we need to change the money system. And they're absolutely right, we do. But as I said, tax is control. One of the things we're seeing in the future, a big change in dynamic. At the moment, 50% of government revenue around the world comes from income taxes. And most income taxes are collected at source. So you never actually receive the money. The government takes it before you actually get it. But more and more of the workforce, A, are turning freelance. And so they're paying taxes after the event. But B, it's not clear where they are. We're seeing the rise of the digital nomad workforce, and probably there will be 1 billion digital nomads by 2035. The rise of remote working, people start becoming digital nomads. They think, well, why do I need to be in expensive New York? I can go and live in Colombia and do the same job. And so you're seeing the rise of this new workforce, and where they pay taxes isn't clear. But more and more, this international workforce, this borderless workforce, are using borderless money. And as soon as government loses control of money and people start using other forms of cash, again, it becomes much harder for governments to tax and regulate. And so there's this enormous pressure for governments to shrink. But at the same time, on the other hand, they've made all these obligations in healthcare and education and whatever else they spend money on. There's this enormous pressure on them to expand. So I think we're going to see this sort of two-tiered economy where you're going to see these free digital nomads who maybe pay lower levels of taxes, work in the digital economy, and these poor slaves in the physical economy who are going to be burdened. You know, they can't move for whatever reason. They can't escape their nation states. But I think if we're having this conversation in 50 years from now, nation states will look very different. And
Absolutely.
they're only really an invention of the physical economy in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution. Before that, borders were much more fluid. And I think we might be going back to something like that. And it brings into role the whole question of the whole role of government. It's very interesting.
You are raising a really important point, Dominic, and I agree with everything you said there. Working in this, like you say, this borderless world, we're working in, I don't need to be in New York City anymore. Like you said, I could go to Colombia. So the governments are losing more and more control, right, over their taxes. Is there a link as to why there's a rush for governments to roll out digital forms of their currency? We see it with, the euro is planning some form of a digital euro, China with a digital yuan, because in a sense, they'll have way more control in how we're spending our money?
Absolutely. It will make it much easier for governments to control and monitor an economy. And the implications are quite Orwellian and Aldous Huxley, if you've read that. Once central banks start issuing wallets and everyone has their wallet with the central bank, governments can start imposing negative interest rates. They can start distributing UBI, universal basic income. They will be able to see everyone you transact with. And it won't be beholden to you to share that information. Governments will be able to see it, and your spending habits say more about you than anything. It allows for much greater government control. And so you see, the whole history has been this dance between those fighting for freedom and those who would impose lack of freedom on everyone else. And it's manifested itself in all sorts of different ways throughout history. But the money and technology is where the new battleground.
Fascinating. Daylight Robbery is your latest book, Dominic, available on Amazon.com.
Yes, it comes out on Amazon, and in another life, I'm a voiceover artist. I've spent many years doing voiceover artists, and if you like the sound of my voice, you can get the Audible, the book on Audible. But it comes out in North America this week.
Let me just wrap with this, because you started the convo by saying we met at the PDAC, the largest mining conference in the world that takes place every year in Toronto. Are you still in the mining sector? Are you still involved with the miners, or are you, peace out with them?
Overweight, Daniela. I can't get rid of the addiction. I'm overweight miners. Actually, fair play to miners. It's not been too bad since about 2017. Practices has got a lot better. There's much less of this, favoring the early investors at the expense of everyone further down the line. It's, the new kids on the block are doing much more favorable schemes. So conduct has generally got better. And, if you can pick and choose the better companies, the better producers and so on, you've done okay. But it's still a very, very difficult sector, very difficult. You just think all I had to do was buy Bitcoin and hold it, and it eclipses everything else. You've really got to pick and choose and study your miners. You can make terrific gains if you get it right, but it's very, very hard. But once you've got the bug, it's a hard bug to shake off.
Did you enjoy the silver squeeze momentum with the silver
all 2 days of it
for you?
Yeah, all 2 days of it.
It's been a long time coming. We'll take those 2 days. Dominic Frisby, thank you so much for joining me here on StansberryInvestor.com.
Thanks, Daniela.
All right, get the book, Daylight Robbery. And thank you for watching. Check out StansberryInvestor.com. There's a A lot of great content there, and keep following us on all our social media channels. Thank you for watching. I'm Daniela Cambone.